Hi, everyone. I'm David Williams, president of strategy consulting firm Health Business Group and host of the HealthBiz podcast, a weekly show where I interview healthcare leaders about their lives and careers. Today, I'm fortunate to have executives from two companies that I admire to talk about real-world evidence. Jenny Christian is VP and General Manager, Medical and Scientific Services within the U.S. real-world business at IQVIA. And Alissa Winzeler-Cotton is SVP of Strategy, Research, and Medicines at Syapse. Makes my title of president it's just so short and compact. So if you like this episode, I really hope that you're going to subscribe and ask your friends to do the same. Jennifer and Alissa, welcome to the HealthBiz podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So we're going to talk all about real-world evidence today, but I want to first just get your backgrounds individually. You're not identical twins, didn't grow up together, so we'll do that part separately. Jenny, I wonder if you could start and just talk about your sort of your upbringing, education, sort of how you got to where you are.
Sure. Thanks. And thanks for having me on the show. I'm born in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, but I grew up in Charleston, West Virginia. And, I guess I was motivated by my dad, who was a physician, and mom, a stay-at-home mom, who both were working very hard and influencing me in the direction of medicine. So when I went to UNC Chapel Hill, I wasn't sure if medicine was the right fit or not, but I was starting to ask questions like, I wonder how this medicine or Benadryl works in our body. Like, what is actually happening? And a friend said, well, you should go to pharmacy school. So sure enough, I went to pharmacy school and was enjoying learning and making different medicines. But while I was on rotations during school, I started collecting information, the hospital wanted to know how well the surgeons were doing with applying antibiotics before surgery. So each morning I would go down and figure out the time in which an antibiotic was given for which patient. Was it before, during, or after? And I started asking myself, I wonder how other hospitals are doing this, or how does this hospital compare to that one? And so someone said, well, you should go study epidemiology and you should, learn some of the research methods. So I looked into it and started a fellowship and at the same time doing a master's in public health. And that was a great combination to start understanding the medicines we're using, but also how to assess it in a larger population or healthcare setting. And then I was getting ready to get married, and my husband was going off, to Brown University in Rhode Island. And so we went up there, and I started a fellowship there in pharmacoepidemiology and realized, I don't have quite enough skills to be able to do my own studies. And, I got kind of a broad overview with the master's program, but so I enrolled and started in a PhD in epi at Brown, while also being a pharmacist in the clinical settings at Kent Hospital, which was a local community hospital and stuff. So it was combining those experiences that were that kind of then led me to want, the last part was that it took 2 years to get, your dissertation completed. And by the time you do all this work and you have 3 publications out of it, I felt like the work was not really being used by anyone, and I really wanted to see my research making a difference or changing a decision. So I wanted to go into industry after that, and then join GSK, a large pharma, where I got to do a number of studies, not just these 3 in 2 years, but now, 40 or so in 1 year, and use the information to inform, everyday business decisions, as well as improving our understanding of effectiveness and safety of medicines. So that's how I got started.
Great. That's a great story, Jenny. I like it how you said, someone told me to go to pharmacy school. Someone told me to get, epi degree. My husband was going to Brown. It sounds like either you had really good people advising you, or you're able to weed out any sort of bad suggestions. Because I don't want to know what else people told you to do. But what they did tell you seems like a good path. At least the stuff you followed.
Yeah, it's good to surround yourself by good mentors and people, and sure, you have to figure out what'll work best for you.
That's good. So, Alissa, how about your story? Is it a similar kind of parallel path to Jenny, or something different?
Definitely I would say the theme of kind of figuring out as you go is definitely part of it. I think that's, just as an aside, I think I very much, when I was graduating from college, felt like I needed to know what I was going to do with the rest of my life. And as you kind of go through, you realize, oh, well, I can pivot here and I can pivot there once I kind of learn more about myself and what I actually really enjoy. But the actual path was very different. So for me, I always loved science. I was in biochemistry major in college, and kind of just really enjoyed, I was in lab and I enjoyed kind of the doing of the science. Didn't really know what I wanted to do when I grew up, but it seemed like in my fields, a PhD was valuable regardless of whether you wanted to be in business or academia. So I went off and I did my PhD in molecular biology, developmental biology at Stanford. Really, it was, I really enjoyed a lot of aspects of it. I enjoyed kind of the problem solving, the intellectual problem solving side of it. And I actually enjoyed doing the research. And I always wanted to do something that was very kind of, interesting, also had potential impact on people's health, right? That is always important to me, to kind of feel like there was a broader kind of impact of what I was doing. But then what I realized was, for me, I wasn't feeling that impact on my day-to-day basis as much as I wanted. A lot of people were able to kind of still hold on to that. But for me, I was working on the molecular mechanisms underlying paralysis. So theoretically, in an elevator pitch, it felt great. But on a daily basis, it just didn't connect to me. I was tutoring on the side, and I felt more meaning from the tutoring that I was doing than I did from my research. And so when I finished my PhD, I was really looking for something where I could, take the problem solving side that I loved, sitting around in a lab meeting, figuring out kind of what experiments we could do to address various topics, but combine it with something that was more working in teams, working with people, as opposed to kind of having your own project that you have to have first authorship on. And then also working on things that were maybe a little bit less lofty, but more impactful kind of feeling to me. So from there, I moved to consulting. I worked for McKinsey for 5.5 years and management consultant. And really, I knew I wanted to stay in healthcare. I love healthcare. And so I was in the healthcare practice exclusively, mostly working with large healthcare systems, a little bit of pharma, a little bit of payer. And there it was really, I found what I was looking for across those different axes, and learned a ton about, business. The first time I said revenue, I laughed, right? Because it was just such a different world. But I found that there were a lot of, I think in science, we tend to think of ourselves as being, what we have learned. It's really kind of, you learn transferable skills. And so I found the ability to translate those skills into consulting. So I enjoyed that. I was there for 5.5 years.
And Alissa, when you first said revenue, was it like in a client meeting and you started to laugh hilariously when you said revenue's going up?
Far before then. So to get into consulting, you have to do these case interviews, right? Yeah. And so you have to they give you a problem, like, okay, if you have a business and you're thinking about going to this new business, what would you think about? And so you do a case study. And so the way to practice case studies is to just practice them and do them. And it's incredibly awkward at first, and you have no idea what you're talking about. And then you read the answer in the book, you're like, how could anybody think of this? Yeah. And so that's when I was laughing.
Okay.
But you kind of train yourself on the basics. It's I think of it as, it's very structured problem solving, right? Just the same way that science is. Science, you take kind of a series of, you're trying to solve a big nebulous problem. You break it down to a series of kind of questions you can address and things you can do to address them. Same thing with when consulting. You just have different pieces of the puzzle that you're playing with. So anyway, I'm digressing a little.
Sounds good. I used to give those interviews. I did have people laugh, and usually we had a certain. Now I'm a Harvard MBA. We had a certain like classification. Okay, that's a real smart person. She didn't go to Harvard Business School. She probably knows something. This maybe is funny. Let me see if I can understand why. It's a special insight there. It's not just something we learned in business school. So I'm glad you made it into McKinsey.
Yeah, no, it was an incredible experience. And I learned a ton. But what I realized as I was kind of getting ready to leave was I had spent a ton of time working with health systems using data that they kind of exported and gave to us, and then transforming that in different ways to help them with their strategy, right? To help them with operations, to figure out, how do we improve flow through the ER, or how do we think about strategy in terms of how do we drive volume within the health system, things like that. And things that felt simple to me from a data perspective were actually incredibly powerful, and they weren't clinical. They were just, business operations questions. And so I wanted to find something in which I was helping them use their clinical data to be able to actually improve patient care. And so that's how I got into real world evidence. And so I've been at Syapse for over 5.5 years now, and leading the strategy function and really kind of helping take the company from kind of an early days company and that had data to really being a real world evidence company.
Well, both of your companies, and I know you didn't name them, so I'm going to make fun of them for a minute. So, when I first hear Syapse, I could laugh at that. It sounds like, is it like Synapse, or is it Cyclops, or what is it? And IQVIA, I think you pronounce it IQVIA, but I hear a lot of IQVIA. And I wonder if people are quivering because of all the insights you're producing, or where that comes from. So,
yes, the name IQVIA kind of came about because it was really this merger between IMS and Quintiles, so IQ. And as you know, Quintiles is a large clinical research organization known for running big clinical trials as well as prospective clinical studies. And then IMS Health was known for data sources and expertise from around the world. And so combining those, IQ, into a number of different ways, or via. And so, IQVIA is really a global service provider for, research, analytics, and technology now. So it's exciting.
But I'm thinking from the quintile standpoint, I'm going to say, I want to preserve that. So that's why I say my IQVIA, like quintiles, right? But if I don't see it that way, then it's IQVIA, which is how I think of pronouncing it. But maybe there's no right way to pronounce it. I don't know. I'm sure there's a lot of wrong ways to say it. But coming back to, both of your backgrounds, what I would say is that I think this is not uncommon for people that are taking a PhD route. You get a lot of like deep knowledge, insights within your specialty area, and then you say, but what is it? What is it achieving kind of in the real world? So, real world evidence in both cases sounds like it would be a great thing to do, and it sounds pretty clear. Working in the real world. But like, what is real world evidence? I mean, what is that really, and why did it emerge in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. Who do you want to take that?
Yeah,
no, that's what I want to say. Like, who's the more real of the real? I think it's one of those. It's like strategic. Who's going to say? So we don't have to have everybody answer each thing, but sort of where does it what does it really mean? So I'll say one of you can take what is it and why, and another one I want to know what are some of the varieties, because it's not just one thing.
All right, I'll start. So real world evidence is really just the documentation of how patients are being treated today, right? So what their diagnoses are, what testing they have, what treatments they're given, and what their outcomes are. And it's not in that form when you get it out in the first place, right? It's just in the medical record, or it might be abstracted a layer to get into something like claims. But fundamentally, it's all deriving from the record of how patients are being treated every day. So it sounds very trendy, but really it's just the documentation of the patient journey and what's actually happening in the real world. And then there's a variety of forms that it can kind of be extracted from to be able to get you to a state where it can actually be analyzed and make some sense out of it.
So Jenny, is it just a more sort of formalized version of what you were doing, going around and seeing when the antibiotic was given and that kind of thing? Is it just a natural extension from there? Was that real world evidence?
Yeah, well, so it comes from real world data, and there's so many different types. In fact, at IQVIA, we have over 1 billion patient records that are coming from either adjudicated insurance claims or open source, like hospital records, or any pharmacy and medical claims. And then there's EMR records. There's lab and biomarker and genetic data. And so the real world evidence is really analyzing and generating insights from any of those real world data sources. Yeah.
So as things have moved from paper to electronic, it's easier to kind of get access to data at larger scale, and it leads to all sorts of new possibilities. What are the key questions that people are asking today that real world data might help to answer? And who is doing the asking other than me sitting here on this podcast?
Gosh, there's a variety of questions. Our team covers health economic modeling. So, as you're generating evidence for payers or for HTA bodies, what is the value story? How cost effective is it? We have an HEOR team generating, clinical effectiveness and comparative effectiveness to other medicines that are out there. How well does this medicine work compared to others that are available to me? And then our epidemiology and drug safety teams are often mandated to follow the safety of medicines by regulators. So FDA, often has post-approval safety studies. Once the medicine's approved and out there being used, how safe is it? And then we have primary data collection teams going, running surveys for patients or providers, or understanding even once this new medicine is available at the site, how are they providing it? What kind of resources does it take? So we do these time and motion studies to what kind of training might be needed, since it's a new infusion, how much time will it take, and those kinds of things. So there's a lot of different ways, that you can answer these questions.
And I guess, Jenny's IQVIA is so broad, and you have access to so many data sets that this could be any sort of an unfair question I'm asking you, because it's sort of a whole variety of people might be asking you things about all kinds of areas. And Alissa, maybe in contrast, Syapse is a little more focused. So I wonder, I'm sure all the things that Jenny mentioned are examples of things that you would know about. But what are the ones that sort of find their way into your world? What are the kind of questions and being asked, and who's asking those questions?
So Syapse is currently focused on oncology, and we have very deep oncology data with kind of paired with both molecular and clinical data combined. And so the questions that we, I would say everything that Jenny mentioned is relevant. I think there's really kind of a whole set of questions when it comes to developing new evidence, right? So figuring out how you develop evidence for efficacy and safety, that's all kind of the same. We also, within that, I think it's different flavors of the same question. So I wouldn't exclude any of the types of questions that Jenny included. What I would say is, for us, we also have very deep relationships with our health system providers that are actually generating the data in the first place. So we have a very focused network that is generating the data, and they aren't just generating, they're not just working with us to kind of create data. They actually want to use the data in practice. And so in addition to generating evidence, we also use insights from the data to support them in caring for their patients. So we also develop insights that help them find patients for clinical trials and that help them support best practice adoption. And we enable kind of them to work on those concepts, as well as to enable our life science partners to kind of help them with that as well.
From the Syapse standpoint, the relationship with your data providers is that you're certainly using the data to answer questions for life science partners, but also just directly into feeding back into the care that's being provided there. And with IQVIA, It would be more that the data is maybe a broader set of data with a broader set of relationships and different types of data. And it's more that that's the starting kind of the raw material that you would use elsewhere, as opposed to kind of feeding it back to the providers of those that are the source of data in the first place. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. So as the questions come in, then then there's this whole process to determine, what is the best optimal data source in which to answer that question. You know, what does the question entail? Are we going to assess mortality? Then, identifying the right data source that has a strong linkage and capture of, mortality within it. And then, from there, do we have all the right variables? Then, can we capture the right patient population within it? Will it be generalizable? Will it make a difference for that individual decision maker? And will it be a sufficient size so that we can evaluate, the question? And then finally, assessing the data quality and completeness of it. Are we following the patients for long enough to answer the question? And even though the database has the variables, are they well captured?
Yeah.
And really, telling us what we think they're telling us. So.
Now, this is one of those things where, as I had mentioned, when things were on paper, you couldn't do any of this. But then just because it's electronic doesn't mean that you can actually do all the things that you'd want to do with it. And if I think about, Jenny, from maybe getting into a little deeper about what you were saying there, if I think about some data like claims data, well, why does the data exist? It's because somebody needed to get paid for doing something. And it's more of a kind of a byproduct that this data might be used to track other sort of things. But if you didn't need to fill in the information in order to get paid, or if you had certain incentives that made it so that you wanted to get it paid a certain way, then if you use that data for some other purpose, it might not be there. You might have to at least understand the limitations of it, or do some manipulation in order to make it, in order to make it fit for purpose.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the a large portion of the challenge is in actually getting the data to the place where it can really be analyzed and give trustworthy answers, right? And so even if you think about the EHR, right, it may be the system of record, but a lot of times the elements that you need aren't in structured form, even within the EHR.
Yeah.
They're usually in a physician note somewhere, maybe, but not always. And sometimes the molecular testing might be uploaded as a PDF somewhere in the system if you search really hard, but not actually easily accessible. And so it's really, what we really focus on is how do we kind of pull together the comprehensive patient record by kind of direct access to the source, and really kind of strong emphasis on kind of data quality and completeness. To be able to then answer those questions that are difficult to answer through traditional data sets that maybe just don't have access to those variables at all, right? So it's a journey, I would say, to get the data to where it needs to be.
So, Jenny, I know there's plenty of challenges in doing what Syapse is doing, but when there's the feedback loop that those that are producing the data are actually trying to use it for patient care, you can see an easier way to see that improvement. What do you do at IQVIA when you're dealing with this broader set of data that may have some of the characteristics, like I was saying up front, in order to ensure data quality and to look at how do you improve it over time for completeness, accuracy, that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, it depends on the data source, but because we have different arrangements, whether we have data brought in-house, or we're working with various partners who are more closely linked with the with the health system or clinic. But it's certainly a process, and we like to carve out a period of feasibility to ensure that this is the right set of and it could be more than one data source that you're using, but allowing enough time to be able to demonstrate that it's not just the patient counts, do we have enough patients in there, but really are the data sufficient to answer this question. So it may be a series of tables to show the data quality of the variables, the sensitivity and specificity of key variables that would be used for the analysis.
Got it. So I think it's now we see kind of the promise and then some of the challenges of the data sources for real world evidence. I'm interested to hear kind of what's the state of the art today, because you have wrestled with a lot of these things, and as interesting it is to hear about, data cleansing and getting completion of fields and putting the blood pressure in this particular field versus another one. Then most people want to know kind of like, what can I do with it? And I know that we're not at the kind of the ultimate destination now, but what are some of the things over maybe the past couple of years that you could do now and say, hey, here's a real, tangible, valuable use of real world evidence that people might be interested to hear about?
So maybe I'll start, Alissa. I've just been thinking about where we're headed, given we're seeing these data increasingly used for regulatory decision making, for payers. Now, Alyssa's describing providing it back to the health systems and clinicians for patient level decision making or formulary decision making. And I'm starting to think, we may see increasing use with parallel analyses, not just demonstrating it in one data source, but are we seeing the same finding in a few different data sources? And we'll give an example of that in a minute. Or are you trying to, the second one is triangulation. So are you trying to get to a big decision, but no single data source is really going to give you that answer. And you need to look in a variety of places in different ways to help inform your decision. And we'll come back to that one. And the third is augmentation, meaning you need to link data sources together to be able to answer the one question. So not repeating it across multiple or parallel analyses, but you need to link to be able to evaluate the question. So I think those are three areas I see us heading towards increasingly. And maybe we can share some examples within those. I'm happy.
Alissa, do you want to give your perspective, and let's talk about a couple of examples? That would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I agree with everything Jenny said there. I think there's we're kind of trying to figure out how all these data sources are separate, right? And so we're trying to figure out the best way to use them in combination or separately to be able to kind of answer the questions that need answering. In terms of kind of where else the state of the art is, right? I think there's two levels, right? There's kind of which use cases are you addressing today with real world data? And from that standpoint, I think the use cases are opening up. I think we're seeing more on the regulatory realm, for example, but there's other areas in which we're starting to push in terms of how real world data is being used. And then there's also kind of the types of sources that are being used to answer those questions, and those are evolving over time, right? We're not just getting EHR data; that people are moving into patient-generated health data too. There's kind of sources are expanding, and that gives us more options, but it also makes more complexity to kind of deal with as you have to think about how you put the pieces of the puzzle together.
Great. So I'm eager to hear some examples, some case studies, maybe of what you're doing. Some specific things would be wonderful, because I'm starting to say, it sounds awfully difficult. We can ask some questions. Can we answer them? If we can answer it, do we have enough people to answer it? Do we have the data sources, et cetera? But what are a couple tangible things that you've done as case studies?
Well, so for the first one, where we're describing the need for parallel analyses, Friends of Cancer Research brought many real-world evidence organizations together to ask, can we establish a framework that would allow us to operationalize some real-world oncology endpoints? Like, how well can we capture mortality or time to treatment discontinuation in patients, in cancer patients? And so Friends of Cancer, along with 6 and then 10 or more real-world evidence organizations, came together around a question for non-small cell lung cancer patients. And through this effort, developed a common protocol that we all used to evaluate time to treatment discontinuation and overall mortality amongst patients who had advanced non-small cell lung cancer who were treated with immune checkpoint inhibitors. So first of all, we all came together and aligned on what question to look at.
Which was not easy.
How do we define it? And how do we define the outcomes? And through that, then estimated, both of those endpoints and saw similar results, although it varied from data source, but it was trending. And we also compared those results to clinical trials that looked at that same endpoint and saw significant overlap in the results. So that got me thinking about how important I think it will be going forward for more questions to want to see, are our findings repeatable or across different data sources. And that was the first of 3 pilots that Friends of Cancer, they've continued to do this now, get going into more depth. Yeah.
Alissa, was Syapse one of the 6 or 10 that was involved in that from the real world side? Yes. It seemed as though you had some familiarity with that. Yeah. How did it look from your perspective?
Very much as Jenny described. I think it was an interesting exercise because all the data is collected from sometimes very different sources, right? Different source types. And so depending on where the data is collected from and how the data is collected, getting to a common set of definitions, a common set of kind of principles in terms of how you'll do the same analysis takes work, right? It's actually harder than it might seem because, at the end of the day, and the FDA guidance has talked about this, you're trying to kind of test a clinical concept, right? You're trying to test a certain clinical question. And in any case, any data set that you pick, you have an operational definition for, a particular line of therapy or a particular diagnosis. And those will show up in different ways depending on which data sources you use. And so kind of getting together to kind of get those definitions aligned so that you can do the parallel analysis was actually, it took some time and a lot of effort by the companies involved to really get it right so that the analysis could be done. So there's a reason it doesn't happen all the time, right? Because it's not as easy as it might seem to kind of do things in that parallel way.
I'm waiting to hear what's easy. I haven't heard it yet, so we'll do a part.
The field is not easy.
A part 2. Jenny, I want to go back to something that you had said earlier about do we have enough patients, not just the patient counts, and never mind if the data is filled in, but I think especially as there's more insight into kind of personalized medicine and the individual things, you can't lump so many patients together. And at the same time, in order to understand the patients, you need to have real depth of data. Is there a approach that's used where you use something like Syapse or maybe a registry where there's a lot of data on maybe a relatively small number of patients to come up with a hypothesis and then use a much wider data set that would cover almost everybody in order to test that out further? Is that kind of thing done? Because I'm just thinking about the challenge of both having enough kind of deep data about any individual to come up with something meaningful, but then say, well, gee, there's only 2 patients like this here within this data set, and we can't have that same level of data on everybody.
Well, you're making me think of this next one, which is augmentation, meaning
good. We didn't set this up ahead of time, right? So
yeah, right.
Okay.
But there, an example was Ibrance, which is a medicine that originally approved a HER2 positive targeted therapy for breast cancer, originally approved for women, but Pfizer, the company, wanted to, extend the label to men, and it was very rare disease in men. I think it was 0.1% compared to 12.5% in females. So they only had a small subset of males in their clinical trial, and within that subset showing similar efficacy and safety. But Then they went to do a couple of different analyses. Like you were describing, David, they used a rich EMR data source and only, a small number of male HER2 positive breast cancer men, but demonstrated similar safety amongst those men who were taking it, since the medicine was approved but off-label. And then in a larger data set with less detailed information, we estimated first the unmet need. How often were males trying to get this Ibrance therapy off-label and getting denied? What was the percentage of claim denials? And then amongst those who were able to access therapy, were they staying on treatment just as long as females were? So not the same, level of detail, but still signaling that those patients receiving this expensive treatment are staying on it. So something must be working. And so using all of this types of information and analyses, Pfizer submitted those data to the FDA, and they were able to extend the claim to males. So I think there is a strategy there around what kind of information can help inform, the bigger decision.
Great. I want to maybe ask a final question that is like going out a few years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever your time frame is, when we've dealt with a lot of the underlying infrastructural issues and solved all the things that actually take all of your time today, and say, what's the vision? What are you most excited about that we can do with real world evidence 5-10 years down the road? What might that look like?
Yeah, I think for me, it's really not just the expansion of use cases, but the integration across use cases, right? So I'm thinking of things like hybrid trial design, right? So today you have for randomized controlled trials, and then you also can develop evidence with real world data. But, there's great potential to kind of capture real world data as part of the trial, right? To capture kind of additional components of the patient record, either during the trial itself in that kind of a hybrid design, or for long-term follow-up to follow those same patients after they've completed the trial and to see what happens to them. There's a lot of energy around that topic today, and people are kind of trying to figure out how to make it work. I think so that's just one example, but I think integrating those different kind of uses of real-world data together to be able to actually kind of do things in a more powerful, more effective, and efficient way is what excites me in terms of how the field is going to evolve.
Yeah.
How about you, Jenny?
Big picture, integrating research with practice so that we're always learning. We're building this learning health system where real-time, high-quality data can inform both our personal health decisions as well as policy and regulatory ones too.
Great. I can't wait, but I'll have to wait.
We're not there yet.
Yeah, good. So Jenny Christian from IQVIA and Alissa Winzeler-Cotton from Syapse, I want to say thank you very much for joining me today on the HealthBiz podcast, sharing your backgrounds, your excitement about real-world evidence, where the field has come, and where it's going. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.
You've been listening to the HealthBiz podcast with me, David Williams, president of Health Business Group. I conduct in-depth interviews with leaders in healthcare business and policy. If you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe on your favorite service. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe on your second and third favorite services as well. There's more good stuff to come, and you won't want to miss an episode. If your organization is seeking strategy consulting services in healthcare, check out our website, healthbusinessgroup.com.